Prince William had signed the order, and by the time the palace staff arrived that morning, the financial connection between the crown and Queen Camilla's extended family had already been severed permanently. Those who understood what the document meant went quiet. Because this was not an impulsive act. This was the conclusion of something that had been building for years, hidden beneath layers of royal procedure, private recordings, and decisions made in rooms the public never sees. The question was no longer what William had done. It was why no one had stopped it sooner. Before we go any further, if you follow royal stories that go deeper than the headlines, make sure you're subscribed. What happened behind these palace walls is far more layered than it first appears. But to understand why William reached for that pen, we have to go back not to the audit report, not to the recording, but to a single evening in Wiltshire that most people never heard about. The palace woke differently that morning. Not loudly, not with any obvious sign of crisis, but those who worked within its walls long enough knew the difference between ordinary tension and the particular stillness that follows a decision that cannot be undone. Voices dropped half a register. Footsteps moved with purpose rather than routine. Eyes stayed down. By 6 in the morning, the relevant departments had already received their instructions. Treasury processing teams had been briefed the evening before. The amended disbursement records were already filed. What had taken months to investigate and days to deliberate had taken less than an hour to execute. The monthly transfers that had quietly left royal accounts for years, routed through a layered system of maintenance grants and charitable disbursements, had stopped. Not suspended. Not placed under review. Stopped. The figures themselves were significant. Not scandalous in isolation, perhaps, but cumulative over time in a way that made the stomach drop when you saw the total laid out across a single page. Year after year, the same accounts, the same family names, the same carefully worded justifications that seemed almost reasonable until you looked at all of them together and realized they told a pattern rather than a story. William had looked at all of them together. The press found out before any official statement was prepared. Someone inside the building or close enough to it had moved quickly. By 8 o'clock, the first messages were moving between journalists. By 9, the headline had taken shape. By mid-morning, it was everywhere. Screens across Britain carried the same image: the palace gates, the gathered cameras, and 4 words that nobody inside those walls had wanted to see in print: royal funds severed. Immediately. Commentators who had spent years covering the monarchy described the move as unprecedented, not merely because of the scale, but because of the method. There had been no quiet conversation first, no gradual withdrawal, no careful diplomatic softening. One document, one signature, one morning, and somewhere inside the building, in a room that does not appear on any official floor plan, the person who had set all of this in motion was already being asked the question that the rest of the world was only just beginning to form. What exactly had he found? The answer did not begin inside a palace. It began in a house in Wiltshire, on a quiet evening several weeks earlier, in a room that smelled of old leather and wood polish and the particular stillness of a life lived mostly in the past. Andrew Parker Bowles was 75 years old. He had served in the military with distinction, moved through some of the most exclusive social circles in Britain, and spent decades navigating the specific and painful experience of watching the woman he had married become, eventually, the Queen. He had done so with a composure that most observers found remarkable. He had never sold a story. He had never granted the kind of interview designed to wound. For years, he had simply continued living, quietly and without drama, as though the extraordinary circumstances of his former marriage were simply one chapter among many. But something had shifted. He would later describe it, to the one person he trusted enough to tell, as a feeling less like anger and more like urgency. He was not a young man. There were things he knew that existed nowhere in the official record, nowhere in the carefully managed biographies, nowhere in the palace-approved narrative that had been constructed over decades, and the weight of knowing them, he had begun to feel, was no longer something he could carry alone. He did not call a journalist. He did not contact a publisher. He sat down in the armchair beside his fireplace, the one worn soft by years of use, and he pressed record on a small handheld device that his son had given him, for exactly this kind of thing: personal memories, family history, nothing more. What he intended to produce was a private document, something for his children, an honest account of what had actually happened, stripped of the diplomatic softness that public life required. He spoke slowly and without theater, in the measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed nothing and was simply, finally, telling the truth as he understood it. He spoke about the marriage, about what it had been in its early years, and what it had gradually become. He spoke about the distance that had grown not suddenly but steadily, The way a relationship can hollow itself out from the inside over years without any single moment you can point to as the cause. And then he spoke about the money, not with bitterness. That was the detail that would later surprise everyone who heard the recording, the complete absence of rage in his voice. He described what he believed Camilla had constructed over the years with the same measured tone one might use to describe a business arrangement. Trusts, accounts held at arm's length from direct royal oversight, financial structures that were difficult to trace and, by design, easy to dismiss as charitable in nature. He was not making accusations dressed as observations. He was simply describing what he had seen, over years, from a position close enough to notice. When he finished, he set the recorder down on the side table beside his armchair. He did not listen back to what he had recorded. He simply sat in the quiet for a long moment, and then he went to bed. He did not know, yet, that the recording would not stay in that room. The recording did not travel far before it found the wrong hands. Or perhaps, depending on how you understood the story, exactly the right ones. A journalist experienced, well-connected, the kind whose name appeared on serious pieces rather than gossip columns, received an audio file through an encrypted channel on a Tuesday afternoon. No covering note, no explanation of origin, simply the file, and a single line of accompanying text that read, "You should hear this before someone else does." She listened to it twice. Then she called the palace press office. What happened next was not unusual by royal standards. The press office acknowledged receipt of her inquiry, thanked her for making contact, and informed her that a response would be forthcoming once the matter had been reviewed internally. It was the kind of language designed to buy time without conceding anything. She had heard it before. She set her own deadline and waited. Inside the palace, however, the call did not produce the ordinary machinery of a press management situation, because the call had arrived at an unusual moment, one that nobody outside a very small number of people knew about. Several months earlier, entirely unconnected to Andrew Parker Bowles or his recording or anything that had happened in that Wiltshire sitting room, a routine internal financial review had been commissioned, not an investigation. The distinction mattered enormously to those who had ordered it. This was administrative work, a standard examination of supplementary disbursement structures inherited from the previous reign, carried out as part of the broader institutional reorganization that followed the death of Queen Elizabeth. The team conducting the review was small. 4 people, all of them senior enough to be trusted and junior enough to be deniable. They were not looking for wrongdoing. They were cataloging, mapping the financial landscape of an institution that had grown, over generations, into something so layered with precedent and informal arrangement that almost nobody understood it completely, but the numbers had not cooperated. Certain outgoing transfers resisted easy categorization. Year after year, funds had moved from royal accounts into a series of external holdings described in the records under the broad heading of charitable and maintenance support. The descriptions were vague in a way that read, "To experienced eyes, less like oversight and more like intention." The destinations, when traced, connected consistently to the same cluster of family names. Nothing in the records was illegal. Every transfer had been signed off. Every categorization had been accepted without challenge. But the cumulative picture spread across nearly 2 decades of archived disbursement data was the kind that made a careful reader sit back from the page and go very still. The review team had submitted a preliminary report 3 weeks before the journalist made her call. The report had been sitting on the desk of a senior royal advisor, waiting for a decision about what to do with it when the press inquiry arrived. Within 24 hours, both documents, the financial report and the details of the recording, had been placed before the same person. William received them separately. He read them separately, and then, having read both, he asked for a private meeting that did not appear on any official schedule. What was said in that meeting, nobody was prepared for. The meeting was arranged for 8 o'clock in the evening. No official notation, no entry in the formal diary. The room chosen was small by palace standards, a working room rather than a ceremonial one, used for private correspondence and the kind of conversation that required walls rather than windows. 3 people were present. William, a senior royal advisor who had served the institution for more than 2 decades, and a legal consultant whose specialty was the intersection of royal protocol and financial governance, a narrow field, but one that had never been busier than in the years following the transition of the crown. The advisor opened the meeting with a word William had been expecting: caution. The recommendation, delivered in the measured language of someone who had spent a career managing exactly these kinds of situations, was to wait, not indefinitely, but to allow time for further verification, for legal counsel to examine the disbursement records in greater depth, for the institutional response to be shaped by process rather than immediacy. The recording, he pointed out, was unverified in origin and legally ambiguous in status. To act upon it directly would be to allow a privately made audio file, one whose chain of custody was entirely unclear, to drive a decision of significant constitutional weight. The argument was not unreasonable. William listened to it without interruption. When the advisor finished, William placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. It was not the full audit report. It was one page extracted from it, a single year's disbursement summary, the most recent on record, with the relevant figures circled in pencil. No annotation, no accompanying explanation, simply the numbers, and the account names beside them, and the total at the bottom of the column. The room went quiet. The advisor looked at the page for a long moment. Then he looked up. He did not dispute the figures. He did not suggest an alternative interpretation. He said, carefully, that the timing of any response remained a matter requiring serious consideration. That Camilla's position within the institution was still, in the broader public sense, consolidating. That any action perceived as personally motivated would be seized upon by a media already circling the story. That the damage to institutional stability could outweigh the benefit of the action itself. William let the silence settle before he responded. What he said was not delivered with anger. Those present would later describe his tone as the most unsettling part of the entire exchange. Not cold exactly, but stripped of the usual diplomatic cushioning. He said that the institution's stability was precisely what he was acting to protect. That an institution which made exceptions for those closest to it was not stable. It was simply comfortable. And comfort, he said, was not the same thing as strength. Nobody spoke after that. The legal consultant made a note on the pad in front of him without looking up. The advisor folded his hands on the table and said nothing further. The document remained unsigned that evening. The meeting ended without a formal conclusion. But as William stood to leave, he paused at the door for a moment, just long enough for both men to understand that the pause was not uncertainty. He had already decided. He simply had not yet told anyone. She was not supposed to be there. Catherine had been advised, by her medical team and by the palace staff who monitored her schedule with careful attention, to rest that evening. Her public engagements had been limited for weeks. The people closest to her had grown practiced at reading the particular quality of her tiredness, when it was the ordinary exhaustion of a demanding public role, and when it was something that required a different kind of management entirely. That evening, they had read it correctly and told her to stay home. She had listened, thanked them, and then driven herself to the palace anyway. She arrived without announcement and found William in the corridor outside the room where the meeting had taken place. He was standing still in the way that people stand when they are not simply waiting but processing, holding something internally that has not yet found its shape. He had the look, she would later describe to one close friend, of a man who had made a decision and was only now beginning to feel the full weight of what it meant to carry it. She did not ask him what had happened in the meeting. She already knew enough of the outline to understand the shape of the conversation. What she had come to offer was not information or strategy or another layer of institutional reasoning. She had come because she had something to tell him that she had never told anyone inside the palace before. She had raised a concern once, years earlier, during a period when she was still learning the architecture of royal life from the inside, still mapping its formal corridors and its informal ones, still understanding which questions were welcomed and which ones were absorbed and redirected without acknowledgement. She had noticed something in the financial arrangements surrounding a particular set of charitable commitments, a pattern that had seemed, to her, worth questioning. She had raised it quietly, through the correct channel, in the correct manner, with the correct degree of deference to the process. The concern had been received, acknowledged with the particular warmth that institutions reserve for people they intend to ignore gracefully, and then it had been set aside, folded into the broader administrative fabric of the palace, and never mentioned again. She had not pressed further. She had told herself, at the time, that she had done what was correct, and that the institution would manage what followed. She had filed it privately, carried it quietly, and said nothing. Until that evening, standing in a palace corridor with her husband, she had never described that moment to anyone. When she finished, William was looking at her with an expression she recognized, not surprise exactly, but the particular shift that happens when something abstract becomes personal. When a question about an institution becomes a question about the people within it, and the cost of their silence. She reached for his hand briefly. Then she said the thing that would stay with him long after every other detail of that evening had faded. Do nothing in anger, but do not do nothing. She left shortly afterward. William remained in the corridor for a long moment alone. Then he walked to his mother's study, sat down beneath Diana's portrait, and picked up the pen. This time, he did not pause. The first person to notice was not a journalist. It was an accountant, a quiet, meticulous man who had managed the financial affairs of Camilla's extended family for 11 years, handling the kind of private wealth administration that never appears in any public record, arrived at his desk on a Wednesday morning to find that a routine transfer had not cleared. He checked the reference number. He checked the originating account. He checked both a second time, with the particular care of someone who does not yet want to believe what he is seeing. Then he called his contact at the relevant Treasury office and was told, in language that was professionally courteous and entirely final, that the disbursement arrangement had been formally amended and that no further transfers would be processed under the existing instructions. He asked if there had been an administrative error. He was told there had not. He asked when the arrangement might be reinstated. There was a pause on the line, brief, controlled, the kind that people trained in institutional communication use when the honest answer is never, but the appropriate answer is something else entirely. He thanked the contact, ended the call, and immediately reached for his phone to make a far more difficult one. Within the hour, solicitors were involved. Within 2 hours, the solicitors had contacted the palace press office. Within 3, a journalist who had been following the story since the initial tip had a second source confirming not the existence of the recording, but the existence of the financial severance itself, concrete, documented, and already in effect. The palace issued no statement that day. The silence was deliberate, constructed with the care that institutions bring to moments when anything they say will be used against them. But silence, in a media environment already primed for the story, functions less like restraint and more like confirmation. By evening, every major outlet had the outline. By midnight, they had enough detail to go to print. Charles was informed through official channels the following morning, not privately, not in advance, through the formal process by which the sovereign is briefed on matters affecting the institution, the same process used for constitutional developments, for legal reviews, for decisions made by members of the royal family in their official capacity. The same process, in other words, that would be used to inform him of a decision made by anyone other than his son. Those who were present when he received the briefing described his expression as unreadable. He asked 2 questions. He received 2 answers. He thanked the advisor and requested a few minutes alone. What those minutes contained, nobody recorded. At Sandringham, Camilla received her own notification through her private secretary shortly before noon. She read the formal document without visible reaction. She set it down on the desk in front of her. She looked out of the window for a long moment at the grounds, the familiar landscape she had come to know across years of quiet mornings and carefully managed public life. Then she asked her private secretary to leave the room. And in the silence that followed, in a house full of people trained never to acknowledge what they had just witnessed, the weight of what had happened finally settled. The machinery had moved, and it would not be moved back. Charles did not request the meeting through official channels. That detail alone told William everything he needed to know about what kind of conversation was coming. Official channels meant advisors, records, structured agendas, the institutional buffer that the palace placed between personal feeling and formal decision. When his father bypassed all of that and sent a private message handwritten, delivered by a member of staff who had served the family for 30 years, it meant the man who wanted to speak with him was not the king. It was his father. They met that evening in a sitting room on the 2nd floor that had no ceremonial function and no particular historical significance. It was simply a room the family had always used for private gatherings, comfortable in the way that rooms become comfortable through decades of ordinary use rather than deliberate decoration. No aides, no advisors, no legal consultants with notepads and careful expressions. Charles was already seated when William arrived. He did not stand. He gestured to the chair across from him in the unhurried way of a man who has been sitting with his thoughts for long enough that formality no longer seems relevant. He did not begin with the document. He did not begin with the financial records or the recording or any of the institutional details that had dominated the previous days. He began with something considerably simpler and considerably harder. He asked William if he understood what the decision had cost Camilla. Not financially. He was precise about that distinction. And the precision itself carried weight and acknowledgement, quiet but unmistakable, that the financial dimension of the matter was not what he had come to discuss. He meant something else. He meant the personal cost. The cost measured not in accounts or disbursements, but in the specific exhaustion of a woman who had spent the better part of her adult life being defined by a narrative she had never been permitted to correct. He spoke without theater. That was what William would remember afterward, not the words themselves, but the quality of his father's voice while delivering them. Tired, careful, the voice of a man describing something painful with the restraint of someone who has learned, across a long life, That restraint is the only dignified container for certain kinds of grief. He described what those years had required of her: the discipline, the restraint, the steady, unglamorous work of rebuilding a public identity from the material of genuine service when the original identity had been constructed almost entirely from scandal. He was not asking William to reverse anything. He understood, he said, that the document was signed, and the accounts were closed, and the institution had moved in the direction it had moved. He was asking only that William understand the full weight of what he had set in motion. William listened without interruption. When his father finished, he did not defend the decision or restate its reasoning. He had already made the case for it in the room with the advisors, and he would not make it again here. Instead, he said quietly that the institution Camilla had worked to earn her place within was precisely what he had been protecting, and that protecting it required the same standard to apply to everyone within it. Neither of them spoke for a long moment after that. Then he stepped back, and the meeting was over. The story broke properly on a Thursday morning, and by noon, it had become the kind of news event that swallows everything around it. It did not arrive through a single outlet or a coordinated press release. It came in fragments, the way the most significant stories always do. A confirmed detail here, a sourced quote there, a document reference that two separate journalists had independently verified and were now racing each other to publish first. By the time any single outlet had the complete picture, the picture was already everywhere. Television networks restructured their morning programming within the hour. Anchors who had been scheduled to cover other stories set their notes aside and turned to cameras with the particular expression that journalists wear when they understand they are sitting inside a moment rather than simply reporting on one. Royal correspondents who had spent years cultivating sources inside the palace were pulled from other assignments and placed in front of live feeds outside the palace gates, where photographers had already gathered in numbers that told their own story. The recording was the detail that drew the most attention initially. Fragments of Andrew Parker Bowles's voice, careful, unhurried, heavy with the particular authority of someone describing what they personally witnessed, were replayed across platforms in a continuous loop. Legal analysts appeared on panel discussions to parse what was verifiable and what remained alleged. The distinction, carefully made by the more responsible commentators, was largely ignored by the audience, who were responding not to the legal status of the claims, but to the human quality of the voice making them. Social media moved faster than any broadcast network could follow. Threads dissecting the financial terminology used in the disbursement records accumulated hundreds of thousands of interactions within hours. Old photographs of Camilla's family were examined and re-examined for context. Royal historians who maintained modest online followings found their commentary being shared by audiences they had never previously reached. The story had found the particular velocity that only arrives when a complex institutional matter becomes emotionally legible to an audience, with no prior investment in the details. International coverage added layers that the British press had not initially anticipated. In Australia, political figures who had been cautiously avoiding the Republican debate for months found themselves being asked directly whether the latest crisis had changed their position. Several of them answered in ways that suggested it had. In Canada, similar conversations resurfaced with renewed energy. In Caribbean nations, where the relationship with the British monarchy had long been a matter of active public negotiation, the coverage arrived not as celebrity gossip, but as political news evidence for those who had been arguing the point for years that the institution's internal contradictions were no longer containable. Trust polling, commissioned hurriedly by 3 separate organizations within the first 48 hours, produced numbers that made palace advisors go quiet when they read them. Support for the monarchy had dropped below 50% across multiple surveys. It was a figure that had seemed, only weeks earlier, almost impossible. Yet within the same coverage, something unexpected was forming. Younger audiences, those who had grown up watching the royal family through digital channels rather than formal broadcasts, were responding differently. Not with anger, not with Republican sentiment, but with something that looked, cautiously and surprisingly, like relief. Someone had finally named it. The engagement had been on the official calendar for 11 weeks. A formal public appearance, the kind scheduled months in advance, coordinated across multiple offices, announced through the standard palace communications process with the expectation that it would proceed regardless of whatever else was happening in the world. Cancellation was not seriously considered. Cancellation would have required an explanation, and any explanation offered in the current climate would have been read as confirmation of everything the palace had so far declined to confirm directly. They would attend, all of them, and they would do what the royal family has always done in moments of private fracture. They would appear composed, correctly positioned, and entirely unreadable. The preparation that morning was described by those present as the most tightly managed they had witnessed in years. Every detail reviewed, every logistical arrangement confirmed twice, the order of arrival, the sequence of movement through the venue, the physical positioning during the central portion of the event, all of it mapped in advance with a precision that left as little as possible to chance or instinct. What could not be mapped was the space between people. Charles and Camilla arrived first. She wore a shade of pale blue that the cameras would later describe as deliberate, a color associated, in the long visual grammar of royal appearances, with steadiness and continuity. Her posture was immaculate. Her expression occupied the precise register that decades of public life had taught her to hold present, warm, entirely controlled. Those watching from the crowd saw a queen conducting herself with dignity. Those watching more carefully saw the effort that dignity was costing her. William and Catherine arrived from a separate entrance several minutes later. Catherine's presence drew its own current of attention. She had been seen publicly so rarely in recent weeks that the crowd's reaction carried something beyond ordinary recognition. She moved slowly but without hesitation, acknowledging people along the route with the particular quality of attention that had always distinguished her public manner. William walked beside her. His expression settled in the way that people who have made irrevocable decisions sometimes settle, not at peace exactly, but beyond the reach of second-guessing. The moment happened approximately 40 minutes into the engagement. Protocol required an acknowledgement, a point in the formal movement of the event where the physical proximity of the two parties made some form of recognition unavoidable. It was brief, correct in every observable detail. Eyes met. A greeting was exchanged in the minimal form that the occasion required, and then they moved apart. The distance that opened between them afterward, 3 or 4 feet of ordinary space that would have been unremarkable at any other moment in any other context, was the detail that every camera in the room found simultaneously. Not because it was dramatic, because it was not, because it was the complete absence of the warmth that had previously occupied that space, made visible by the absolute correctness of everything surrounding it. A single frame, captured by a press photographer who had been covering royal engagements for 20 years, ran on the front page of every major British newspaper the following morning. No caption was needed. The image said what no official statement had managed to say, that something between these people had changed permanently and without the possibility of being photographed back into existence. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of aftermath, not resolution, not healing, simply the slow, unglamorous process of people and institutions absorbing what had happened and beginning, without any formal announcement, to reorganize themselves around the new shape of things. It is a process the royal family has undergone before, across generations and crises of varying severity. They are, whatever else might be said about them, experienced at continuing. Camilla returned to public duties within the fortnight. Her schedule was lighter than it had been, fewer engagements, shorter appearances, nothing that required sustained exposure to the kind of prolonged press attention that had defined the weeks immediately following the story's publication. Those who observed her closely described a woman who had not diminished but recalibrated. The warmth that had always been her most effective public quality remained intact, but something behind it had shifted register. The way a piece of music played in a minor key carries the same notes as its major version, while producing an entirely different emotional effect. She did not speak publicly about what had happened, neither did her legal team, after the initial flurry of statements in the story's earliest days. The silence was professional and complete, and communicated, to those who understood how these things worked, that the decision had been made to absorb the situation rather than contest it further. Andrew Parker Bowles gave no interviews. He had said what he intended to say in a private room in Wiltshire, into a device he had never meant to share, and the world had done with it what the world does. He was seen once, briefly, in a village near his home, an old man in a wax jacket, moving through an ordinary morning with the unhurried pace of someone who has discharged a long-held obligation and is now simply living with the consequences of having done so. Charles continued. That was the word that those around him used most consistently in private. Continued. He carried out his duties with the discipline that had always been the most underestimated quality of his character. He appeared at the engagements on his schedule. He received the people he was required to receive. He said the things that the role required him to say. But those who had known him across decades described a man occupying a particular kind of internal grief, not for the decision, which he had come to understand if not to welcome, but for the version of the family he had quietly hoped was becoming possible, and which had now been replaced by something more complicated and considerably more honest. William did not speak about it either. He did not need to. The signed document spoke with a clarity that no subsequent statement could have improved upon. Those who worked with him in the weeks following described a man who had moved forward, not without cost, not without the weight of what it had taken to reach that desk and pick up that pen, but forward nonetheless. Catherine remained at his side. That, perhaps, was the detail that the cameras could not fully capture, and the newspapers could not adequately explain the specific, quiet significance of her continued presence beside him. After everything, Prince William had done what the institution demanded, and what his conscience required, and the distance between those two things, and the cost of closing it, would be felt inside those stone walls for a very long time.